In the next couple of lessons, we are going to create a Gerbera-like flower. This flower is a good introductory example for modeling plants from scratch with nodes. We will use randomness to create many different variations of the same plant. Finally, we will add wind animation to the flower and export it to view. We want to keep this a beginner-friendly model, so instead of building very small stamp details with real 3D geometry, we will use a texture map for the stamp, as you can see in this example render. So let's get started with modeling the first part of the flower. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is to switch the units from meters to centimeters, since we're working on a flower and not on a tree. So let's go to File Options, and on the General Preferences tab, let's choose centimeters and click OK. So in this first part of the tutorial, we're going to model the stalk, and we're starting off with an advanced segment node. So let's add one to the scene and rename this to stalk. And I'll zoom in onto the entire plant, and let's increase the parameters window. Okay, so I would like the base stalk to be something in between 25 and 35 centimeters. So I'll use a length of 30 and plus minus 5 centimeters. And again, let's zoom onto our entire stalk. And next up, we need to set the radius to a fixed value. So I'm going to use something around 0.15, so 15 millimeters, which will result in a diameter of 3 millimeters. Next, let's look at the tropism setting. So tropism is a force that is not going to be apparent right now, but as soon as we have a plant part that is not exactly pointing towards the sky, but rather bending to either side, tropism will start to have an effect. So tropism in a plant is the tendency of the plant to grow either towards the sky or bend towards the ground. So we want to add some amount of tropism to our plant, something like this. And maybe let's add some variation of 0.2. And in order to see the effect of the tropism setting, we now need to bend our stalk. So let's go to the Influences tab and activate the local bias. So a bias is nothing more than a force that acts upon a certain part of your plant, and there are various types of forces available. And we're going to use the direction force, which will bend the geometry into a specific direction. So let's choose a direction along the x-axis so that the segment bends to the right. And I would like to add some variation to the bending strength, so let's use a value of 0.3. And now I would like to change the force distribution along our stalk so that the force does not act equally strong on the stalk everywhere. So let's edit our orange filter curve. And I would like to reduce the strength at the beginning of our plant part. And let's keep it more constant around here. I'll uncheck the snapping option so that I can move the points more freely. And let's maybe increase the strength around here. And let's decrease it towards the top so that the top starts to point straight upwards into the sky. And I like to make this a little more rounded, so I'm going to change this into a smooth curve. And now the strength doesn't change as abruptly as with a linear curve. Let's click OK. And of course we don't want every stalk to always bend into the same direction. So in order to introduce some randomness, we have two possibilities. We can either randomize the direction, which is a little more complicated because there's no randomization for the direction built into the node. So we would have to work with a more complicated solution. Or the easier way is to simply go to the Transform tab and rotate the entire stalk randomly which will look as if it bended into another direction. So let's use a rotation around Z of 0 plus minus 360 degrees. And by creating new variations, we can immediately see that it looks as if our bending direction changed with each and every plant. Okay, so I'm going to reset this to our default seed of 0. Well, let's go back to the Parameters tab. And next up, we are going to add some textures. So let's go to the root node, because the stalk inherits the material from the parent, and the parent in the scene is the root. So we're going to edit this material by doing a double click, and the material editor will open. So when you use the material editor in PlantFactory for the first time, you will start with the basic material editor, but we would like to use a PBR material for our plant, and in order to get access to PBR settings, we need to switch to the advanced material editor. And now we have a drop-down menu where we can go from a simple material to a PBR material. And now all the tabs inside the material editor changed accordingly and now contain the different slots that are common to PBR materials. So let's go to the first tab, to the color tab, and change the mode to a map picture, because we're going to use a texture. And I'm going to select the stem color texture in here. Click apply. No, I don't want to use the alpha information. And next, let's add a normal map. So again, I'm going to switch to map picture and choose the normal map for the stem. Now for the metalness, we could leave this as a constant value, which is 0% metalness, because there's obviously no metal in our stock. But in order to make the export a little easier, let's again switch to map picture and choose a black image, which is the same as 0% metalness, and use this image instead. Now for the roughness, again, we're going to switch to a map picture and select the stem roughness, click apply. And for the ambient occlusion, we're doing just the same. And let's choose the ambient occlusion right here. And I'm going to rename this to Stalk. Okay, now we can go into our stock and go to the Materials tab, and we can adjust the tiling of the material. So I think the tiling around the stock is fine, but the tiling along the height could be a little less. So let's go to the V tile and decrease the amount of repetition. And this looks a little better to me. Okay, so next we're going to add some branching stalks that will grow from the side of our current main stalk. And we don't need to change many things. Instead, we can simply copy and paste our existing stalk node. And let's rename this to branching stalk. Let's connect this to our first stalk. And now we need to go back to our first stalk, and now we have a new tab for our child that we just connected. And on this tab we can influence the placement of our newly created branching stalk. So at first, let's reduce the number to 1 plus minus 1. So either we will have 0 or 1 or 2 branching stalks from the main stalk. And I would like the stalk to start around 0.3. And let's add just a tiny bit of height variation. And the end should be around 50% of our main stalk, again with just a tiny bit of variation. And since everything is selected randomly by PlantFactory, we're not seeing anything because this particular seed apparently does not produce any branching stalk. So let's click the dice icon, and we can immediately see that with other variations we now have a secondary branching stalk that grows out from the main stalk. So let's go back to the parameters and let's take a look at the orientation tab. So I would like the orientation to be steeper and closer to the main stalk, so I'm increasing the growth angle, and the growth angle is the angle down here between the main stalk and the secondary stalk. So the bigger the angle, the closer the child is located to its parent. And I would also like to introduce some rotation around the main stalk so that not every stalk grows from exactly the same point. So let's add some rotation, plus minus 10 degrees maybe. And finally, let's scroll down and go to the blending group and check blending and check use subdivision surfaces to create a better blending. Let's take a look at the wireframe. And now we have a nice blend between the topology of our main stalk and the topology of our branching stalk. Okay, so now we need to make some more modifications to our branching stalk. So let's go to the settings of our branching stalk. And the first change that we're going to make is on the segment tab to the length. So 32 centimeters for the secondary stalk is way too long. So I'm going to change this to 10 centimeters plus minus 3. And I'm also going to reduce the amount of tropism just a tiny bit. And maybe remove the randomness altogether. Okay, next up, let's go back to our influences tab and add some more biases or forces to our secondary stalk. So I would like the stalk to curl a little, so let's change the force type to curl. And I would like each stalk to curl individually into a specific direction that is unique to itself. So we're not going to use world coordinates, which would mean every copy of our branching stalk curls into the same direction. Instead, we're going to use local coordinates, and we're going to introduce a curl along the y-axis and maybe reduce the strength a bit and add some variation, so either lots of curl or no curl at all. And I would like to decrease the curl effect at the beginning of our branching stalk. So let's simply move the filter down a bit. And finally, because PlantFactory does not have collision detection, I would like to make sure that the tip of our stalk, which will receive a blossom at the end, is going to avoid the main stalk so that we don't get intersections between the blossom and the main stalk. So I'm going to add another bias, and this time I would like to make sure that the tip of our branching stalk grows as far away as possible from the main stalk, and the main stalk is located at 0, 0, 0, and it grows towards the sky, so it has a z direction of 1. So I'm going to use the axis repeller setting and change the z direction to 1, positive 1. And now I would like to limit the repelling effect to the tip only. So again, let's edit the filter and move the curve down towards 0. I'm going to activate snapping so that I hit 0 exactly. Let's add another point. And so up until 70%, the repelling strength has no effect at all. It's set to 0% strength. And then at 70% height, the repelling strength is suddenly 100%. So only the tip is going to be repelled from our main stalk. And let's click Okay. And maybe let's increase the repelling strength even more so that it really points into another direction away from our main stalk. Now the last thing we need for our stalks to be complete is sort of a conical shape at the top, which will be our transition for our blossom that we're going to add in one of the next lessons. So let's add a third advanced segment. We can also do that by doing a right click, going to geometry and choosing advanced segment. And this one I'm going to call stalk transition. And let's connect this to our branching stalk. And we will change the placement of our transition from axis of the segment to tip of the segment. And let's reset the angle so that it sits right on top of our stalk. And now we need to make our transition a lot thicker. So for the inheriting ratio, I'm going to increase this to 600% so that it will have 6 times the diameter of our stalk. So let's click OK and deactivate the wireframe. And now I can use the radius curve and change this to a smooth curve to create sort of a conical shape for our transition. Let's click OK and reduce the length to 1. And that was a little too thin, so maybe let's try 700% and let's uncheck the snapping mode and move the curve a little higher. Let's zoom in to get a better view. Yes, that looks good to me. And by going back to our branching stalk, we can now activate blending with subdivision surfaces. And now we have a nice blend between our transitional conical shape and our branching stalk. So let's repeat this process for our main stalk. I'm going to connect the transition to the main stalk as a new child. And on the main stalk, we now have a new tab. Again, we're going to change the placement to tip of the segment, activate blending with subdivision surfaces, and remove the angle. So let's take a look at what we currently have. I'm going to increase the resolution just a bit so that we get smoother curves. And let's create a couple of variations to see what that looks like. And I think that's not too bad. So in the next tutorial, we'll take a look at how we can add leaves to our flower.